What is up guys, Jason here, and I'm coming at you with a Duel Masters strategy video. So what I wanted to talk about today was improving the mana curve. I'm going to try to make a case for the inclusion of more 2 mana cards in decks in general. So I guess because rush decks we assume only play cards which cost between 1 and 3 mana, I am more referring to say control decks or tempo or mid-range decks. I think the utility that you can gain from playing cards earlier in the game is something that has been understated, and it's something that I personally have not put a lot of emphasis on until recently. So I think even if you aren't necessarily convinced that this is the way to play the deck, I hope I can at least open your mind to a different way of thinking and make you realize, hey, maybe this is worth trying out myself. So a bit of backstory: as you know, my Duel Masters meta was basically dominated by control decks, and because of that landscape, the way I started building decks would be to skew them towards power cards. We would have higher counts of cards like Lost Soul, Natural Snare, very expensive cards, and what that meant was early in the game we wouldn't really be doing a whole lot. All the plays would really start coming out on turns 5, 6, and that's really not a good way to play, because it's a strategy that's easy to play around. If you're playing against another control deck, if they're able to pull cards out earlier, you're kind of screwed. If you're playing against Rush, well, you basically lose in like 4 turns. So I thought, what, this isn't optimal and this isn't fun, so maybe let's try out something else. I'm sure that people probably would have realized this much earlier than me, but I thought, at least better late than never, and if you guys are just discovering this for the first time, then great, I hope I am able to help. Now, right as I get into it, I just want you to keep this phrase at the back of your mind. Or this question rather. Well, what else would I be doing with this 2 mana or on this turn? Now that is a question that I asked myself fairly often, and that made me realize this is why these cards do warrant some sort of inclusion in the deck, because it's something for me to do, and they result in me getting some good utility out of them. Now, let's get into the cards themselves. So for light, Rain of Arrows, look at your opponent's hand, and he discards all darkness spells in it. So it's good early game for a couple of reasons. You gain some relevant information. So let's say that your Rain of Arrows whiffs completely. He has no darkness spells for you to discard. Well, you at least get to see what cards your opponent has in their hand, and that allows you to formulate a strategy accordingly. Let's say you're trying to set up with Emeril, or you're trying to play down a creature to evolve, and then you see they have Phantom Dragon's Flame or Crimson Hammer. Having that information will allow you to play around that strategy, or at least change your strategy so that you don't get controlled or stopped by your opponent. I also think that the potential upside in card advantage is really worth the cost. Darkness decks on average will play 4 Terror Pits. If they have them, they will try to play 2 or more Cranium Clamps. They might play Ghost Touch, they might play Lost Soul. So if you play Rain of Arrows at the cost of 2 mana, and it results in your opponent discarding 2 or 3 cards, that's a pretty big plus for you. On average, I feel like Rain of Arrows would net a 1-for-1 against Darkness decks. So that is, you play Rain of Arrows and you just discard one of your opponent's cards. I think that's pretty darn good. Now, later into the game, it's really strong because it stops power plays like Terror Pit, and more importantly, Lost Soul. When my friends and I used to, or actually when we still do play control against control, we find that it's basically a race to see who can play Lost Soul first. First Lost Soul wins the game. And playing Rain of Arrows to stop your opponent from playing Lost Soul is oftentimes just as powerful as playing the Lost Soul itself. So Rain of Arrows, 2 mana card, easy to get, big fan. Farzi the Oracle, 2 mana 1k Lightbringer. What his effect is that when he dies, you can grab a spell in your graveyard and put it into your hand. So early game, he's pretty neat because he can attack players. You have the option to put on that early game pressure. But the biggest selling point is that he increases in utility as the game progresses. One thing that's really neat that I noticed is that there isn't much in the form of spell retrieval in the English Duel Masters game. The only other card that immediately comes to mind is Foul Ega, which costs 5 mana. Sure, you get access to the spell the moment you play him, but I feel like Farzi more often than not is going to be dying on your opponent's turn, so you pretty much get that spell straight away. Anyway, when I say he increases in utility as the game progresses, what I mean by that is the later into the game you go, the more spells there will be in your discard, and as a result, Farzi becomes an out to more things. Early game, you might only be able to get like Ghost Touch and Energy Stream, Crimson Hammer, but then later in the game you'll probably gain access to things like to that extra copy of, Cranium Clamp or Lost Soul or whatnot. So Farzi the Oracle, I think, is a highly underused card, most likely because he came out in DM12, but I think he's super neat, and if you can find the right deck for him, or if you just want to chuck him in, I think he is really worth considering. Now taking a look at my favorite section, the water section. Emeril, as you probably know, is one of my favorite cards. He often guarantees a shield trigger, so if you play him and you have a shield trigger in your hand, why wouldn't you put that down? Shield triggers, as you know, very powerful cards in the game. Emeril, like Farzi, can attack players, so he also helps with that early game pressure, and I also think is a form of pseudo draw support. So what I mean by that is he gives you access to more cards. Let's say you don't have any shield triggers when you open with Emeril. I think it's still sometimes worth switching cards around. Like maybe you can put down that real expensive card that you're not going to play for the next 5 turns into your shields so that you can hopefully find something better that you can play. More access to more cards is, I don't think it's ever a bad thing, especially if it's optional. So yeah, that's another way Emeril is useful. Later into the game, obviously, he combos well with Illusionary Merfolk, which lets you draw 3 cards when you have a Cyberlord out. The other card is Emergency Typhoon. Draw 2 cards, then discard a card from your hand. So the main thing for Emergency Typhoon is that it lets you cycle through more cards in your deck. Unlike Energy Stream, unlike Brain Serum, it's not going to result in a +1. In terms of card advantage, it's just 1 for 1. You lose Emergency Typhoon and the card that you discard with its effect, but then, it gives you access to 2 cards. So you -2, +2, you net 0. Because gaining access to more of your deck is more often than not a good thing, I also think it's seldom going to be truly a dead card. So you aren't really going to be like, man, I wish I didn't have Emergency Typhoon right now. Sure, you could say like, I wish it was Energy Stream or something else. But if you get to see more of what's in your deck and you get to like a means to look for more cards that you're after, well, I can't really see that being bad. Very cool, in my opinion, for combo decks or decks that require setting up, because it lets you find the pieces much earlier. You can start drawing more cards in your deck outside of your draw phase by turn 2. I think that's super neat. In the next section, we are looking at Darkness now. We have Ghost Touch, so your opponent discards a card at random from their hand, and we have Propeller Mutant, and his effect is when he dies, your opponent discards something at random. So basically when he dies, it's Ghost Touch. I think Ghost Touch is awesome for the early game disruption. I mean, sure, you're down a card, but if you can disrupt your opponent's strategy, why not? Especially if your deck is something that hits its stride later into the game. So not necessarily just control decks, but certain combo decks like Survivors could really benefit from Ghost Touch. Or even like a Demon Command deck if you were building it, just if you think about how expensive Demon Commands tend to be. So yeah, I mean, in terms of card advantage, as we discussed, it's a 1 for 1. Now, later into the game, I think it's a really good follow-up to Lost Soul. Basically, if our opponent is out of cards in their hand, we want to make sure that their hand is kept to a minimum. So Ghost Touch is pretty good for that. He only costs 2 mana, so he's cheaper to play than Locomotiver. When I say he's still good for late game control, what I mean is, and this is something that I did discuss during one of the deck profiles, once late in the game when you play a control deck, you kind of get to this point where you have to decide whether you want to control the field or whether you want to control your opponent's hand. Sometimes you just can't do both. But because Ghost Touch is so cheap and only costing 2 mana, sometimes you will be able to do both, and that's, well, naturally a very powerful effect to have. Propeller Mutant. So like the other 2 creatures we discussed, he can attack players, and he is just highly disruptive in nature. Like, very seldom will your opponent be happy to discard cards in their hand, and that will often result in them playing around Propeller Mutant. And you know what? If they're trying to play around a 2 mana 1k attacker, I think that you've put yourself in a pretty good situation. In my experience, Propeller Mutant is a card that really forces your opponent to think, and I think for that reason he can be very, very powerful and annoying. Looking at fire, we have Rickaboo's Screwdriver. Now, his ability is a tap ability, and it's to kill one of your opponent's blockers. Simple as that. I think it's awesome because he can attack players despite that awesome ability, and he instantly pressures your opponent's blockers, so it makes your opponent think twice before playing something, especially because his effect is reusable. Now, later into the game, if your opponent doesn't get rid of him, he can basically win you the game by just getting rid of your opponent's blockers, easy as that. Playing Rickaboo's Screwdriver could be the difference between victory and defeat, because, you know, playing 2 removal cards isn't exactly easy to do. When I say great efficiency against stronger creatures like Thrashcrawler and Tajamal, I guess once you consider that Rickaboo's Screwdriver only costs 2 mana and you can use his effect an infinite amount of times, that's pretty awesome when you consider that some blockers cost as high as 3 or 4 mana. So you use a 2 mana card to get rid of a 3 or 4 mana card. That's pretty awesome to me. And for the nature section, we have good old Fairy Life. It's a form of early game mana acceleration, and if you've seen the strategy video on mana acceleration I did, you'll remember that it sets up for your 4 mana card on turn 3. It's also a form of deck thinner, and as we just talked about, it's good to get through and have access to most of the cards in your deck as soon as possible. When I say it could help perfect math your mana, what I mean by that is later into the game you might find yourself in a position where that extra mana gained from Fairy Life is the difference between victory and defeat. So yeah, Fairy Life, super cool. One thing worth noting is that unlike the other cards, which tended to be 1-for-1s or -1s, Fairy Life in a way is actually, sorry, 1-for-1s or +1s, Fairy Life is actually a -1 in a way, because, you know, you play Fairy Life, so you lose a card in your hand, but you don't replace it with anything else in your hand, and you don't replace it with something that's immediately on your board. However, I do think that mana is an extremely valuable resource in Duel Masters, and that mana acceleration is actually a big deal. You know, again, what else were you going to do on turn 2, right? Now, some other common 2 mana cards that we would find in many decks are blockers. Now, these guys, their primary function, of these ones in particular, the ones that cost 2 mana, are to stop yourself from getting rushed and stop yourself from losing to, you know, those aggro type of decks. And while that's fine, I do have to point out one key weakness, which is that they are particularly vulnerable to Coral. Coral, as you know, allows you to return one of your opponent's creatures to the top of their deck, effectively setting them back a turn. Coral isn't so effective against the lower cost / utility creatures because most of the good ones have come into play effects. So, you know, yes, you know, it's still annoying for your opponent, but it's not as, the Coral effect is not as devastating as it could be if those are targeted. So what I mean by that are, like, let's say you return Aquahulkus, you know, your opponent still gets to draw another card. Or if you return, say, a Meteosaur, your opponent still gets to blow something up. With these guys, when Coral bounces them, it's really bad because you get set back a turn and you have to, you know, play them again. And that wraps up my video on Duel Masters improving the mana curve. If this is something that you were already aware of, hopefully I did something to reinforce that great idea that you had already come across. And if not, well then, you know, I always try to make these as educational as I can. I hope I did expose you to a new way of thinking or some new strategies. If you're able to take something away from this and have fun with it, that's what really is most important to me. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.